In 1989, Nintendo released their first fully fledged handheld console, the Game Boy. The world had never seen anything like the Game Boy before this point. Nintendo previously worked on the Game & Watch systems, but those were all standalone devices, only coming with one game and varying wildly on controller design. The Game Boy was special because it brought the concept of cartridge game swapping to handheld devices, which allowed people to buy games after the fact and play them on the same console. It was positioned as a sort of handheld NES, and alongside every Game Boy was a copy of Tetris, the most popular game in the world at the time. Hank Rogers was the one that suggested Tetris be the bundle title of the Game Boy, saying, "If you want little boys to play the Game Boy, pack in Mario, but if you want everyone to play the Game Boy, pack in Tetris." And to say that everyone played the Game Boy would be a very accurate statement, because alongside Tetris and other games like Pokemon, the Game Boy and Game Boy Color went on to sell 118 million units before it was officially discontinued. But you know what would have made it sell 2 million more units? So in part 3 of Play FNaF on literally anything but a PC, I'm going to be looking at FNaF ports on the Game Boy. Now some of you may be confused as to why I'm not playing FNaF Pocket Horror, a Game Boy themed FNaF fan game that made the rounds a few years ago. And that's because that is not actually a Game Boy game, just a PC game themed like a Game Boy one. Shocking, I know. Today I'm reviewing 2 actual Game Boy ports, which means yes, you can play these on an actual Game Boy. Okay, so I don't actually have a Game Boy to play these on. I could get a used one or build my own with this special FPGA kit, but I don't really have that type of money right now. So I instead opted to use the official Game Boy emulators that Nintendo distributed and use an app called an injector to make a virtual console port of these games. You can play these games directly on their respective itch.io pages or on a flash card on official hardware, but I felt like this was the closest way I could get to playing on official hardware. Heck, I'm using official software at this point. So the ports we are looking at today adapt FNaF in 2 very different ways, and it's very surprising how the game gets translated over to the platform. When it comes to Game Boy ports of old, oftentimes the developer attempted to just directly port the game to the console, but other times they just became entirely new editions of the game, even changing genres of game in order to make the portable jump. And in this case, FNaF is no different. Let's first start with Five Nights at Freddy's by KBLM Studio. This is a direct port of FNaF to the Game Boy, and it's rough. Now, I have to give props where it's due. This port is very impressive, especially with all the FMV-like animations for the jump scares and stuff. It's actually very impressive that they got this working at all, and it really feels like it came out during the Game Boy's heyday. Think like how they shrunk down Donkey Kong Country into Donkey Kong Land, or even the old Castlevania games. In fact, this game is very reminiscent of the Game Boy Castlevania game because it's as slow. So being a direct port, there were bound to be some issues due to how the Game Boy actually runs games. It's not unplayable, but there are huge problems like slowly panning side to side to the ends of the room to look at the doors and stuff. Now you are luckily able to interact with the lights and doors without looking at them, which is good, but this blows, man. It takes forever to look around. From what I understand, this is something that was fixed in the newest beta release. However, development of this game has been postponed indefinitely, so we are stuck with this. Also, the reason I'm not playing the alpha version is because the doors and lights literally do not work. It took me a while to realize, but the way that you control the lights and doors is actually pretty clever. Due to the limited amount of buttons, you basically have to switch modes by hitting down on the D-pad. In the bottom right corner, you actually see a little guy get covered with a door, which indicates that now you control the doors instead of the lights. And by hitting the D-pad again, you switch back to the lights. It's really clever. Both the lights and doors are controlled by the A and B buttons, and A and B both control different sides of the room, which is pretty neat, I guess. This is what allows you to control them without directly looking at them, so I guess it's useful, but it's a bit confusing because I keep on messing up which button does which. I'm stuck in my old ways from these other FNaF ports. I keep on thinking like the A button does the lights or something. Select pauses the game and tells you how much power you have left, and start opens the cams where you can see everyone, and everything looks like absolute garbage. I love it. Basically, all of the backdrops are just 2 or 3 colors, and then the animatronics are just one primary color based on their most prominent colors on their models. I actually really like how the animatronics were visualized here. Other than Freddy in the cams, everyone is really readable, and I imagine on a real Game Boy screen, this would have been very helpful. I also like how the jump scares are represented. They're like super compressed, monocolored full motion videos that are super glitchy and tiny, and it just screams. I'm barely getting this to work at all for real. With all these visual drawbacks and compression artifacts, it really does help this game feel like it came out around the time the Game Boy was being sold. I don't know a ton about Game Boy development, but what I do know is that the Game Boy and Game Boy Color were able to do a lot more, but many developers never fully utilized the full potential of the platform because of just general lack of knowledge or budget constraints. And this feels like one of those third-party ports that was made on an extreme budget. It's oddly fitting, but like, man, the controls are just not it. Also, this game does not play accurately at all. Foxy and Freddy are active on night 1, which shouldn't be possible, and the AI is sped up. I noticed something was up because everyone was moving way faster than they were supposed to. It literally made it impossible to beat this game because everyone was just reacting too fast to everything. I recently have been playing a lot of FNaF 1, like a lot of it, for a future video, so I knew when I saw Freddy leave the stage that something was up. By the way, if you want to see that video, you better subscribe. Only 7% of you are subscribed? What is... But like, I swear, Freddy just came from the stage to my office in 10 seconds. And this was all in the first hour in night 1. It's a cool novelty, but this is definitely not ideal, especially with how slow everything else is. A lot of multiplats on Game Boy were like this, and it's not a surprise that many did not move forward as direct ports. When Capcom wanted to port Resident Evil to the handheld, originally they attempted to port the whole thing to it. They even got as far as getting a pseudo 3D environment working on the Game Boy, which is wild. I never played the OG Resident Evil games, but looking at side-by-side footage of the game compared to the original, it's kinda wild how close they got. However, this port did not move forward for obvious reasons, and instead Resident Evil Gaiden was released, being a much simpler game for the hardware to run. Being a top-down adventure and semi-rhythm game thing, it's weird. So maybe, if FNaF was made during this time, it may have taken the form of a different type of game entirely, like a point-and-click adventure game. So this port was done by Phoenix Adverdale, I think that's how you say that, and it converts the first Five Nights at Freddy's game into a point-and-click adventure game. In this game, we actually play as a female night guard, and we might even play during or after the main game, in an alternate timeline where the night guard we play as dies in the establishment. The game is pretty short. It has multiple endings, and you get rewarded for exploring the pizzeria and solving puzzles. The story is short and really bare bones, but it has its moments. Like, you can discover Springtrap in the secret room if you do certain events in the right order, which is really cool. And he looks terrifying here. Kinda reminds me of some VHS horror stuff with how he's illustrated. You can also discover the body of the previous night guard in the Freddy suit, similar to the Game Over screen in FNaF 1. This game really prides itself in adapting story elements from all the games and presenting them in this 8-bit retro crunch fashion. And the visuals are superb for the Game Boy. Maybe I was just conditioned from the previous one being like super compressed or whatnot, but like this game looks amazing. Being a point-and-click adventure, the game doesn't have to be concerned about having things running at any reasonable speed. Plus, there are no QuickTime events, so the game can focus on being super pretty. I especially like this shot of the animatronics up close. The perspective shot and the lighting really emphasize how big the animatronics are compared to the player. Now, it sucks that they don't do any actual jump scares in this game. Being a point and click adventure game, sure, it wouldn't have been scary, I guess, but just hitting the game over screen when you mess up is a bit lame. Though I do like these custom game over screens, and I also find it weird that you can't just die to Springtrap. He comes to life and stuff, but you just leave. This port feels more like a proof of concept than anything. It's a damn good one. However, the gameplay loop is fairly quick. You are only required to do one task per night, and on my first playthrough, it was very easy to just miss all of the important stuff. For a point and click adventure, I would have hoped that there would have been more puzzles to do, more things to interact with, but this game is a bit restricted in its reach. While there are multiple endings, the way to get to all of them is virtually the same, except for the Springtrap one. You have to kind of go out of your way for that one. It's a good game, but it's a very short experience. But I mean, hey, if you recently got something like an analog pocket or built your own Game Boy, they're definitely a fun little piece of Game Boy homebrew. And I hope more of these demake ports start to surface so developers can continue to improve the game design to more adequately emulate the original game, while also catering to the hardware they're on. It's really cool to see FNaF run on anything and everything. It's kind of like the doom of the indie horror scene. FNaF on ColecoVision when. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.